This is a video about the GCSE Biology topic Adaptations. This comes up in Unit 7 of AQA GCSE Biology and Combined Science. By the end of this video, you should be able to define what's meant by an adaptation, identify adaptations as being structural, functional or behavioural, describe how animals and plants are adapted to very cold environments, very hot environments, being a better predator, avoiding predation, maximising photosynthesis and enhancing reproductive success, and you should be able to describe what is meant by an extremophile. Adaptations are features that enable an organism to survive in the conditions in which they normally live, what we call their habitat. Those adaptations can be classified as being structural, behavioural or functional, and they're produced by evolution over a relatively long time frame. When we say that an animal or a plant is adapted, we don't mean that it's changed its behaviour in its lifetime or it's grown a thicker coat. We mean that over maybe thousands of years and several generations, that species has become better adapted to the environment in which it currently lives. Adaptations can be classified as being structural, behavioural or functional. Structural adaptations are physical changes to the body, so this could include things like having horns if you're an animal or thorns if you're a plant to avoid predation. It could include plants growing very tall to have more sunlight or growing long roots to get more water, camouflage or mimicry where you evolve to look more like an organism that is more dangerous than you are. Also changes to surface area to volume ratios to help you to either conserve heat or lose heat, and also insulation, so things like having a thick layer of blubber or a waterproof coat. Behavioural adaptations are about how an organism acts, so that includes things like penguins huddling together for warmth, elephants flapping their ears to help them cool down, swallows and other birds migrating depending on the seasons, and also hibernation. Functional adaptations are about changes to your metabolism, so that could include things like how camels sweat very, very little, which helps them to remain hydrated in the desert, or how certain kinds of desert shrew produce very, very concentrated urine, again to conserve water, or it could also be things like a change in reproductive timing. First, let's look at the adaptations of a penguin to an Arctic or polar habitat. Firstly, we can see that she's a little bit of a chunky monkey. She's got a thick layer of blubber and that helps to insulate her against the cold. Additionally, her feathers are oily and that makes them water resistant. That means that when she goes swimming to catch fish, she's not going to get as cold as quickly. Then we've also got the behavioural adaptation that penguins are famous for, huddling. The point of huddling is that all of the penguins stand together in a group. Firstly, that reduces the number of penguins that are exposed to the cold, so the ones on the inside are shielded by the ones on the outside, and the penguins all rotate around so that everybody gets that benefit in turn. Secondly, it reduces the overall surface area that's exposed to the elements, so that's going to reduce the heat loss. Here's another example of an animal that lives in a polar habitat. Pause the video and see how many different adaptations you can write down that help it to survive where it lives. Like the penguin, the Arctic fox has a thick layer of fat which helps to insulate against the cold. Additionally, it also has a thick fur which is going to help it to keep warm. And as well as being thick, that fur is also white, which is going to help it to camouflage against the snow. You might also have noticed that the Arctic fox has got very small ears and very small feet. Both of these are going to help it to keep a small surface area to volume ratio, and that's going to minimise heat loss. Next, let's look at adaptations to the desert environment, which is very hot and very arid or dry and often has very little food or water available. This camel has an incredibly hard mouth. It has really, really hard lips, and that means that it's able to eat desert vegetation that lots of other animals wouldn't be able to eat because it's just too dry and woody or because it has thorns, so it can eat things like acacia bushes. Secondly, it has this fat store in its hump, and it's able to break down that fat store to release either energy or to release water, and so it's able to go for a really long time without needing to eat or drink. Thirdly, it produces very little urine and very little faeces, and both of these are going to help it to conserve water. It also basically doesn't sweat. Camels are temperature tolerant, so whereas you or I would start to sweat more as soon as our temperature rose a tiny bit, a camel's temperature can rise 5 or 6 degrees before it begins sweating, and again that helps it to conserve water. In the desert there are often sandstorms, and so camels have extra long eyelashes to really close their eyes tightly so that when one of those sandstorms happens, their eyesight doesn't get damaged. Finally, they have really tough hooves, and this allows them to walk on the very, very hot sand in the middle of the day. You might also encounter some adaptations that are less clearly useful to animals living in the desert. This jerboa survives in the desert by being nocturnal. He sleeps during the day and only comes out at night. And actually, deserts are really cold at night, not to mention dark. So despite living in the desert, he has thick fur because when he's out and about, it's actually pretty chilly. He's also got huge eyes because at that time of night, it's going to be really challenging for him to see. And he's got really long whiskers because they're going to allow him to feel the sides of his burrow. You may also notice that he has absolutely huge back feet. This is going to help both because it's going to make him quicker and allow him to run faster, but also because they're going to help him not sink into the sand. It's not just animals that you need to be able to describe the adaptations of. A really common exam question would ask you to describe and explain the adaptations of animals and plants in a particular environment, and often if you only talk about animals, then you can only get half the marks. This stone plant is able to survive really successfully in the desert, and it's adapted in a number of ways to allow it to do so. Firstly, its leaves have a thick, waxy cuticle, and that's going to prevent water loss. Secondly, it has very long branching roots, and this is going to allow it to access water even when it's deep underground. It stores that water in its thick, fleshy leaves, but obviously that makes it a prime target for animals that need a water source. So it kind of looks like a stone, and that's going to help it to be camouflaged and to avoid animals trying to eat it. While they're not true of this particular plant, you may also want to think about some other adaptations of desert plants, like having spikes, again to avoid animals eating you for a source of water, or making poisons. These could either be to protect against predation or to poison other plants, because if there's a very limited source of water, then you want to make sure that other plants can't get to it. And so poisoning them is one way to avoid that competition. Next up, predation. How is this penguin adapted to help it to catch fish? Well, it has a streamlined shape, and that's going to help it to swim really fast. It also has powerful wings or flippers to allow it to swim very quickly, and when it does get to those fish, it has a very long, very sharp beak. Here's a different example of a predatory bird. Pause the video and see if you can write down 2 ways that this hawk is adapted to catch and kill its prey. As we can see from the photograph, it has very sharp claws or talons and also a really sharp beak. You might also be able to get some credit for talking about it having very powerful wings and being able to fly particularly quickly. There are a really large variety of ways that animals and plants can avoid being eaten. If you think about a typical prey animal like a rabbit, we start off by thinking about the fact that they have very large ears and they have their eyes positioned at the sides of their head. Both of those are going to help them to detect a predator before it can catch them and eat them. Another way to avoid being caught by a predator is to be well camouflaged and blend into your background, like this snail on the leaf here. This means the predator is less likely to see you and therefore you're less likely to be eaten. If the predator does catch you, it's a great idea if you either taste bad or are poisonous. If you're lucky, the predator might spit you out, and even if you're unlucky, they're unlikely to eat another one of your species again. So, looking at the whole population, it's a good idea to have evolved to taste bad. If you do taste bad or you are poisonous, it's a really good idea if you have warning coloration, like this ladybird here. In the animal kingdom, often being red and black or yellow and black tells a predator that either you have a sting or that you taste bad or that you're poisonous, and that's going to mean that they avoid eating you in the first place. If you can't produce a poison, or if it's just too energetically expensive, it's sometimes a really good idea to mimic something that does or that can. The hoverfly is a classic example of this. Its yellow and black stripes make it look like a wasp, so lots of predators will avoid it thinking that they might get stung, but actually it doesn't have a sting at all. If you're a plant, then you might grow thorns or prickles or spines that will stop herbivores from eating you, and I guess the animal equivalent of this is to have sharp horns with which you could attack a predator. Finally, you might have a streamlined body shape, or you might be really muscular, and these things are going to help you to escape a predator by running away faster. Here are 2 more prey animals. Pause the video and see if you can write down how they're adapted to avoid predation and also how those adaptations help to keep them safe. The Australian stick insect looks like a leaf. In other words, it's camouflaged. That means that the predator is less likely to see it and therefore less likely to eat it. The antelope is also light in colour, so it's also camouflaged and less likely to be seen. But on top of that, it has horns which allow it to defend itself or fight back. It also has long legs and is able to quickly run away from many predators. And finally, it has eyes on the side of its head and large ears, both of which are going to help it to detect the predator. Most plants absorb all their energy from sunlight. So in order for them to complete photosynthesis and grow, they need to capture as much light as possible. The most obvious way that they can do this is by growing large leaves, like this giant water lily. Another good thing to do is to have a really long stem or a tall trunk that allows you to tower over the other plants. But if that's not an option, you could be a climbing vine and climb up other trees, or you could be an epiphyte which lives in the branches of other trees. In aquatic plants like this bladderwrack, we sometimes see air-filled pockets, and these help this seaweed to float on the surface of the water to maximise light absorption. Another thing that plants may do is to poison their surroundings so that other plants can't come close. This helps to minimise competition. It's no good surviving if you don't then reproduce and pass on your genes. So animals and plants have a wide variety of ways to increase their reproductive success. Plants may be pollinated abiotically by wind or water, or biotically by animals, including insects, birds, or even bats. To attract pollinators, plants may have large, colourful flowers. Not all animals see in the same spectra, so for instance, bee-pollinated flowers may look white, but they often have UV markings that the bees can see. These flowers may be scented, either with a pleasing floral scent if they're pollinated by bees or butterflies, with a musky scent if they're pollinated by moths, or even with a scent like rotting meat if they're pollinated by flies. The plant may make lots of sugary nectar to tempt in the insects. To help with seed dispersal after the flowers have been pollinated and the fruits have been made, fruits could be fleshy so that animals eat them, or they may have hooks on the outside to catch into animal fur. Plants that are pollinated by the wind are more likely to produce large quantities of very light pollen, and they're also likely to have long feathery stigmas that hang outside of the flower so that they can catch the pollen as it's drifting past. Animals may attract a mate by structural adaptations like having colourful plumage, or also by behaviours. This could be things like birdsong, bower building, gift giving, and mating displays where an animal tries to show how strong it is. Finally, in this video, we need to look at extremophiles. Extremophiles are organisms that are able to live in an environment that is too extreme for most things to live there. So this could be very high temperature, very high pressure, or also very high salt concentration. Organisms that can live in these environments are called extremophiles, and one example of an extremophile is the bacteria that live in deep sea vents. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope that you found this a useful introduction to adaptation in plants and animals in a range of environments. If you did find it useful, let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more GCSE Biology updates coming soon.